Hey, good morning everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, obviously, back together face to face in one room, the biggest gig in terms of face to face I've done for a while. I'm almost going to claim the oldest artefact for out-the-red conferences in the state. I think my Keep Cup dates back to one that we had outside of Ballarat around about 2008, but I did see someone walking around with one of those One Planet over-the-shoulder red carry bags, which I think preceded that. So, I don't know if that person is here. There it is. Excellent. So your conference takeaways can last a long time. Through the unknown, unremembered gate. If you want to know where that comes from, what do we say these days? Google it. That's a line from poetry that I was resonating on in the middle of lockdown. Not only for myself, but for all of our students at university who we were meeting online and trying to teach and trying to encourage them to go outside. And that feeling that we were, locked away and hankering for someone just to open the gate or open the door and let us outside. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to work our way through to the origin of the line and the poem and try and put it in some context. I could have easily also titled today's talk, or what does a world war, a couple of revolutions and a global pandemic have to do with OE and OB? Now I was raised in a household with two teacher parents. My mother was an art teacher and an artist. My father was a teacher of English Lit and History and also a school principal. And the house was full of books and artworks. And I love books and art, and there's going to be a bit of that as we go through today's talk. And I also studied modern European history in VCE in 1978. And I've been trying to think of a way to get that into a lecture, and this might be my last chance. Pedagogical Tact. This is a book by Max van Manen, a Canadian educational philosopher. And I think it's a good launching point for today's talk. There's that word, pedagogy and pedagogical. I try and explain that to students by going back to the ancient Greek origins of the word. And the pedagogue was the person in a family, the servant usually, who was given the task of taking the hand of the young child and walking them to school and picking them up and taking them home each day. And on the walk to school, the pedagogue's task was to teach the young child good manners and to greet people along the way and to be a good young citizen. And so that's an image of pedagogy and being a pedagogue or a teacher that I like to give to my students. So the word actually means the child leader. And Max van Manen, if you can't read the subtitle there, it says, knowing what to do when we don't know what to do. And that's kind of about where we're at, I think. So over the last few decades, we've seen this rising, if we want to call it a crisis, in youth, but some really quite sobering statistics and information. 3/4 of UK children spend less time outdoors than prison inmates. Richard Louv famously wrote Last Child in the Woods and coined the term nature deficit disorder for young people in 1995. So this has been upon us for a while. Some Australian statistics. I'm going to focus on the bottom left-hand grid here because that's the age group that we typically work with the most. 12% of children and 2% of adolescents meet the daily physical activity and screen-based behaviour guidelines recommended by our health department. That's 1 hour of moderate physical activity a day as the minimum, and no more than 2 hours of screen time per day. Curiously, the definition they apply to that also is outside of screen use for education. So I'm guessing that our kids are spending, that's a bit old, that stat, I'm guessing that our kids are spending way more than 2-3 hours a day when you add their own time plus school time. Young Australians online, 97% of 15 to 70-year-olds are online. They are the highest user group of online activity. They They spend at least 18 hours per week online, outside of school hours. They use it for social networking, entertainment, education. This is a risk-taking age group. So they are exposed to an endless number of risks in the new social online world. This is a really good site if you want to dig a little deeper and find out the kind of risks that young people are exposed to in the online environment. And of course we could make a long list: cyberbullying, exposure to inappropriate material, and so on. Okay, it's an excellent website for unpacking some of the hazards and risks that young people are exposed to. And we talk about hazards and risks a lot in outdoor education and outdoor recreation, but there's a whole new world of risks that young people are exposed to that if we don't know enough about them, we probably need to start educating ourselves. We may well be living in the midst of the digital revolution. You can have a read down here about some of the kind of obvious surface level innovations and how quickly they have happened. So we are talking only the last, well, really 30 to 40 years. Whether you have a utopian view of the new digital world or a dystopian view, I probably just lean slightly towards the dystopian view, which is why one of my favourite films about what the modern world is going to be like is The Matrix. Whether we're in the Matrix or not is up to you, but this is a remarkably rapid development. I can remember in the mid-1980s when the first desktop computer was brought into the Catholic school I was working in secondary education, and was proudly put down in the staff room and sat there for people to look at. And at recess or lunchtime, you had no hope of getting on it because the science boys were on it playing Space Invaders. And I think one day they probably had it in service, and so I managed to creep over to it, had a couple of rounds of Space Invaders and said, "What's all the fuss about?" And I went back to the ping pong table. And then the development, of course, has swept across us incredibly rapidly. We all now are just in the midst of, or emerging from, whichever one we believe, of the COVID pandemic. And that sort of rhetoric around now is it's changed education forever. We'll never be able to go back, so they say. I believe that this has accelerated and exacerbated the kind of online world, some for better, some for worse, that we all live in, but especially that our young people live in. As we go through the talk, I'm going to take a couple of diversions. Before the first diversion, I just thought I'd put this up, and I don't expect you to be able to read all that text and print up there, but it's a kind of little artefact of, I think, where outdoors, Vic perhaps, certainly outdoor ed, has been, and it's been pretty stable now for several decades. This is a summary of research that's been done, multiple research studies that have been done, and looks at what teachers and leaders rate as the most important outcomes for outdoor experiences. And we get that sort of phrase, self, others and nature, and can see that that's been fairly consistent across different studies with different population groups. Anthony Keeble put this together as part of his recent doctoral thesis. If you want to go and read it in some more detail, you can access his thesis just by looking at that online, typing in the title. You can get the PDF from the Fed Uni thesis site. And Scott Polly in the second column has just completed his thesis, a longitudinal study of nearly 20 years of looking at South Australian outdoor educators and looking at the changes that they have felt, the challenges that they face. And again, the picture is that we've been in, I think, a pretty stable pattern, which I'm going to try and unpack a little bit later on. But before that, our first diversion. This is a grizzly bear. I've been working in secondary education for about 6 years and decided I wanted to learn a little bit more about what I was doing in terms of taking young people, particularly into the outdoors in Victoria. And so I packed up and went over to Canada and did a master's degree at the University of Calgary in about 1988. And I had some astounding teachers. The approach to education in universities in Canada at that time was very liberal. And we studied everything from educational philosophy through to ecology and so on. Max van Manen wasn't one of my teachers, but I started reading his work back in the 90s. But my mentor, Bill March, suggested when he saw my interest in wilderness and taking people outdoors that I go and do a class with a fellow called Professor Stephen Herrero. And he was running a subject called environmental reserves, and it traced the history of the environmental movement. It was on from 7 to 10 p.m. on a Wednesday evening in midwinter in Calgary. So I went along to my first class. Now, Steve had been a pioneering big wall climber in Yosemite, and he was also the world expert on bear attacks. So we came and we filed into our small tutorial room. There were about 30 people in the room, and only space for about 12 people to sit around the table with Steve. And Steve fixes with his steely glare. He's about 6'4" and still as wiry as a climber. And he simply said, "This is a serious class with lots of reading and lots of discussion. I like to have about 12 people in this class. There are about 30. And he said, "I think by about week 2 or 3 we'll have 12. And he said, "Here's the first week's reading. Wilderness of the American Mind by Roderick Nash, which is a classic." He said, "Read this before week 2. Come back, you need to know it." So I came back in week 2. Now, fortunately, there was another grad student who had just left who had left me his copy a couple of weeks before, and I was about this far through. So I put my head down and got my way through Wilderness of the American Mind and fronted up the first class. And Steve's MO was simply to go around the room, "Josh, tell us about primitivism and the rise of the Romantic movement in France in the late 1700s. And if you couldn't answer, Steve's gaze was withering enough for you to really think seriously about fronting up for week 2. There's the young Ponch, with the reading for week 2 and 3 probably well on the way. It was a fantastic class and gave me a knowledge base in terms of, the longer view of history and how we are all wrapped up in that. And started to explain to me why, if we go outside here, we're likely to see national parks, we are talking about climate activism, we're talking about social justice, and we're talking about young people. All this flows together, and I started to get a handle on this class. Another diversion. Some cultural commentators at the moment are saying we're going through the biggest seismic shift in how we experience life since the Second World War. This is T.S. Eliot, who survived the London Blitz in World War II, the bombing of London, and saw London on fire and burning and being converted to rubble, and of course also thought about the plight of young people in this situation. So concerned was the British government about the likely invasion of London and the bombing of London in 1939 that they launched Operation Pied Piper. And Operation Pied Piper moved 2 million children out of London over a weekend and sent them to the countryside. They were packed up, said goodbye to mum and dad, put on a train and sent out to the countryside. It's not the first time we've all had to wear masks and had lives disrupted on a monumental scale. And this is where the title for today's talk comes from. It's a small excerpt from one of T.S. Eliot's last epic book-length poems, and it's from a poem called Little Gidding. And Eliot was hankering for a simpler life. He did survive the bombing, was quite unwell, went back out into the rural, picturesque English countryside and sat and contemplated what it would mean to survive this kind of experience and what it was like for children. I'll let you just read that excerpt in your own voice for a minute or so. So our children have been removed to the countryside, and actually this photograph is them climbing over a gate in the Dartington estate, which was the site for one of the first large outdoor education conferences in the UK in the early 70s, and actually came up with a definition of outdoor education that I think we still pretty much use today, which included this notion of self, others and nature. But I think it goes a little deeper than that, which we'll get to in a moment. Some of these children had happy billets or foster parents. Some were put to work. Some stayed in small town institutions. Here's the girls open their sewing class. But it wasn't a good experience for all. Anna Freud, the daughter of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychologist, actually did one of the first large-scale studies of childhood trauma based on the children who were evacuated to the countryside, and found basically that they suffered long-term PTSD, and her study primarily was in mother-child separation. It reminded me that I think we're going to need to be very alert. Our children were not removed from their families in the recent pandemic, but their lives were completely disrupted on a similar scale, and are likely to exhibit a range of similar mental health conditions that perhaps these evacuee children did. C.S. Lewis, as I told you there's going to be some books. C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, as part of his Chronicles Narnia, is the story of a group of young children who are evacuated from London during the Blitz and sent out to the countryside. And of course, like a lot of fables for children, it has them pass through a portal, in this case the door, on the wardrobe, and go into this fantasy world, if you like, where they're faced with all the problems that adults face, in this case the battle of good and evil, and have agency to make changes in that world. And I think that's why some of these stories endure. But I also have some concerns about young children being thrown into the world of adult concerns and crises. Of course, they're now available to all young children via the internet at a click. They see this and are exposed to it every day. Another brief diversion. As part of my work in Steve's class and studying my modern European history, I looked at the Industrial Revolution, and I actually think this is incredibly important to understand in terms of outdoor education. The Industrial Revolution, of course, had a series of waves through it, and the first was the rise of steam power, and here's one of William Turner's paintings depicting the new coal-fire-powered tug mightily hauling off one of the great battle sail ships of the British Navy to be broken up and wrecked in the wrecking yards. It marked a kind of seismic change and shift in culture. The other part of the first wave of the Industrial Revolution was the rise of mass production, particularly in the textile industry and the spinning mills. Now there were a group of radical rebels led by the mythological Captain Ludd, who were called the Luddites or the Luddites, who saw their world of small craft guilds being annihilated overnight by the rise of industry. So they thought they'd do something about it. And they set about raiding these large-scale spinning mills and taking sledgehammers to the machinery. Now this was seen as a pretty big threat to the rising industrial capitalists and the government. So the government passed a law that made this a capital punishment, and many of the Luddites were rounded up and publicly executed or transported to Australia. So this first rebellious wave against the rise of industrial capitalism was wiped out pretty quickly. There may well be a little latent ripple of Ludditism in outdoor ed, with some of our resistance against the continual onslaught of modern technology and the desire to still do crafting and make our own objects and things like that. The second wave of the Industrial Revolution involved large-scale mass production of iron and steel, and the rise of locomotives and the mass movement of people. There's another book that addresses this. Of course, people were watching what happened in the mass movement of people into the cities and the despoilation of the countryside. The cities were incredibly crowded and polluted, and the countryside was being exhausted through pollution in creeks from mining and so on. It's actually part of the setting for Tolkien's The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. We know that Tolkien was writing in part about his experiences in World War I and his experience in industrial warfare, but was also writing about the Industrial Revolution, and the hobbits represent children in that time, and the fact that their lives were about to be annihilated and changed forever by the endless march of industrialism. And for Tolkien fans, I think it's the mines of Moria which represent the sort of furnaces of the Industrial Revolution. The second great reaction to the Industrial Revolution is the one that I think, if we followed a family tree, is what we are a part of, which was an intellectual revolution, a philosophical revolution. And we saw the rise of the Romantic movement. One of the key figures is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, a French philosopher and writer. And in 1762, he wrote this quote as part of a book that I'll mention in a moment. "Send your children out to renew themselves, send them to regain in the open field the strength lost in the foul air of our crowded cities." I think he was onto it. All that time ago. A very, very brief walk through some ideas about Romanticism, because it occurred in several phases. And the first one was, if we think about our art and great writing that comes from that time, is the notion of the outdoors as the picturesque. And we look at a painting on the left by a constable called the Hay Wain, and there's this notion of this bucolic English landscape that's under threat and perhaps disappearing. That gave way, or was superseded by a notion of the sublime, and we have this painting by Caspar David Friedrich where he's standing above the Wanderer above the sea of mist. And the notion here is that humans would go out into wild nature, or the remnants of wild nature, on a rocky headland across a stormy sea, or out in the mountains looking across the valley, and they'd feel the majesty and might of nature, or God's finest creation, if you wanted to look at it that way, and they would gain a perspective of humanity, of small and its right place in nature, which was something different to what was happening with the Industrial Revolution, which was conquering all. And a final phase, which I think again is really significant for us, is that eventually our wanderer steps into the scene and is no longer happy just to watch and feel from a distance, but wants to participate in this wild nature. And so we get this sort of early wave of outdoor recreations and things like mountaineering. This is Gustav Dor's etching. There's a series of etchings of the first ascent of the Matterhorn. And as part of my second bout of graduate studies, I started reading Robert Macfarlane's work, and one of his early books, called Mountains of the Mind, A History of Fascination, charts the whole rise of an activity like mountaineering and puts it in this cultural context. And he comes up with this term, what we want to experience in the outdoors is a pleasurable fear, which kind of was a penny-dropping moment for me in my own studies about outdoor river travellers and adventurers, and whether that gave them a sense of attachment to place or not. Back to Rousseau very briefly, because this wasn't just an intellectual and philosophical revolution about connecting close to nature, it was also about our view of children. And coming out of Emile was a whole philosophy about the young child, that children are different to adults, that they're born innocent and vulnerable, that they take time to develop, that they develop through stages and phases, that the educator's role is to create a positive learning environment, not necessarily to always instruct them in the sort of ways of being an adult, with an adult curriculum, if you want to call it that. And down the bottom, that children should remain in ignorance of those ideas beyond their grasp. These are the hallmarks of progressive education, were picked up by people like John Dewey in North America, and we now call it experiential education, but they're pretty stable. These are the foundation pillars of a lot of what we do. And here's someone like Rousseau, and it's a mistake obviously to attribute this all to one person. This is a broad social movement. I've picked out one character, but mainly because a book like Emile was so foundational in our educational thinking, and it came out at the same time. It was important because the view of children leading into this was they were simply little people. And that was important for the powers that be, the industrial capitalists, because if they're just little people, you can put them to work. And they did. Here's a photo around about 1830 of a group of young boys who were chimney sweeps. Of course, these little people are perfect for sending into these hazardous, dangerous environments. They can go up and down the chimneys and sweep things out. Doesn't matter, they're just little people. They can make those choices and suffer the consequences. Girls had small, nimble hands and were perfect for working in the textile industry, particularly with fine lace. So they were put to work. It's important for us to realise that towards the end of this, it wasn't just the Romantics, but there's also a groundswell of movement that started to make significant change. 1833 was the first Factory Act that started to regulate child labour. 1834 introduced the Poor Law in the UK, which provided public housing for the destitute. These are all things we take for granted today. 1880 saw the first Education Act in the UK that made school compulsory to the age of 10. And in 1901, there were some limitations on the minimum working age of 12. Victoria, by the way, had its own Education Act not long after this in the 1880s, Public Education Act. So these great seismic changes bring to us not only philosophical and intellectual changes, but also law and legislative changes. And I'll finish today by thinking about what some of those may be if we are indeed in the midst of the next great social and cultural revolution, the digital revolution, and how we are beginning to legislate and think about children in that context. How am I going for time, Josh?
You have 20 minutes.
Ah, breezing along. Who thought that a trip through history could be so quick? What was happening in Australia at around about the same time? Well, some of these ideas came along a bit slower in Australia. We know when we look at artwork and stories and poetry from that time that there was still a notion that the outdoors was a dangerous place for kids. And Frederick McCubbin famously painted this series of The Lost Children. And the notion that here's our young girl who's maybe wandered off the track on her way home from school or whatever it might be and become lost in the alienating Australian bush. She can't navigate her way, there are no landmarks, she can't see the horizon, and so she's forlornly lost. This is also evident in Australian literature for young kids, famously with something like Snuggle Pot and Cuddle Pie, which is perhaps not on everyone's reading list these days. But the notion that the nasty Banksia men could come by and if you weren't paying alert, could snatch your young baby and take it off into the bush. And in Australian film up until really recently. I don't know if any of you have seen, and it's fairly close to home, Picnic at Hanging Rock, where a group of young schoolgirls are swallowed up by the countryside, by Hanging Rock not far from here. And even a film like Walkabout, which has the young, very British children through their schooling, abandoned in the outback, and they encounter young David Gulpilil, one of his first acting roles, and the story unfolds about their survival or not. Now, being a young fella in a artsy sort of family, we were taken along to see all these films and read all these books, and something like Walkabout left a fairly lasting impression. Pretty confronting. I think we sort of see a really significant change with something like Storm Boy. How many people in the room have seen the film Storm Boy? Amazing. Amazing. Okay, the original. not the remake. It's a load of rubbish. Don't watch that. So I had some resonance with Storm Boy and Colin Tierley. He was a South Australian author. He was also an educator. He was a teacher, a school principal, and then the head of a teachers' college in Adelaide. While he was doing that, because he didn't have to be online checking his email at night, he wrote 100 books. And of course, as a lifelong educator, had an incredible insight into what we now call the lived experience of children. And for me, a book like Storm Boy, and of course, you've all put your hands up, you know the story, is not a fantasy world where the child is sent off to try and solve the world's problems of good and evil and fight the adult's battle. In this, it's basically a rewriting of Emile, where the child is given time in nature to slowly mature, to go through these developmental stages. There's a pedagogue in the story, which is Fingerbone Bill, again played by David Gulpilil, who slowly, patiently introduces and educates the young Storm Boy to the ways of nature in a very subtle manner. As with romanticism, as with Emile, the end product or the end purpose of this kind of slow, steady education is to become a fully participating citizen in a democratic society. That's what Rousseau was on about. Nearly cost him his life, because that was a heretical idea. Tierley, is a great writer, and if you want to pursue some of his other books, he has a series of books that also have female protagonists as well. And in each one, they're put into a situation where there is some kind of challenge, but it's localised, I would say place-based, achievable and realistic for a child at that stage of their development. He really focused his work on teenagers. It wasn't long after that probably Australian society again went through a phenomenal shift, and we saw a federal government election decided by a local conservation issue, the fight to save the Franklin. And again, you may well know your history of this, but the Tasmanian government, both sides of government had just had a state election, both voted to build the dam. The Hawke government campaigned in 1982, a little bit later, that it would stop the dam. The Hawke government was put into power, and then they had to take the Tasmanian state government to the High Court of Australia to prove that a Commonwealth government could overrule, in matters of environmental conservation, could overrule a state government, because state governments in Australia have responsibility for land management. At the same time, in 1983, when the High Court ruling came down, I think that was the first year that there was a dedicated undergraduate degree, a Bachelor of Outdoor Education Studies, or Bachelor of, maybe you know, Marcus, the history, at Bendigo. So again, this was a time of ferment and change in Australia, where a lot of these kind of romantic ideals and political ideals came to a head. Which leads me back to where we started. And the impact of COVID-19 and the rising digital revolution on young folks. Perhaps one of the first things that we should do is get out and talk to and listen to a lot of young folk. And if you don't have that opportunity, I really recommend the Age and Sydney Morning Herald's podcast, Enough, which presents the voice of young children and the kind of mental health crises that they're facing. Are we living in the third phase of the Industrial Revolution? Or are we in the midst of the next big, huge cultural shift in Western history, the digital revolution? I think the thing about these great revolutions is it is impossible to imagine what life would be like on the other side. So we have lived in the shadow of the Industrial Revolution for nearly 200 years. I think it would be borderline impossible for us to imagine what our lives would be like and the lives of our children would be like pre-Industrial Revolution. We may well be in the midst of something that we can't see the other side of yet, but I have no doubt that it's going to change all our lives profoundly And I think we need to reflect on what that means for the work that we do and for the lives of young kids. We are just starting to see the emergence of legislation around the protection of children in this new environment. If we go back and think about the exploitation of children in the Industrial Revolution and the subsequent laws that needed to follow to protect them, both in terms of their health and well-being, but also their education, I'm starting to wonder about what will those laws and legislation need to look like to protect our children, who perhaps at the moment are the equivalent of child labour for the tech giants, who are basically enrolling those kids as users into that tech world. The US Congress passed the first Children's Online Privacy Act in 1998, and even though some of these apps weren't around then, they could see the need to protect children, and they made it illegal for a tech provider to enrol a child under the age of 13 without their parental consent. Now, I don't know if you've been onto any of these sites or not and opened an account, but I think it's pretty much a tick box. And kids have worked out how to tick a box on the computer. Australia has now also got its own Enhancing Online Safety for Children Safety Act, brought in 2015, and we now have an e-safety commissioner for children in the federal government as a bureaucratic position. What might this mean for us? And again, this may not represent all the work we do, but I'll make a few comments. I think the diet of, or the philosophy of self, others and natures has stood the test of time, but might not stand the test of the future, and so requires perhaps some rethinking on our part, and not necessarily to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but to think about adaptation, adjustment, tweaking, reconceptualisation. What might it mean in terms of the types of educational outcomes that we have for young people in these programs? If I look at this and consider that our kids are failing to meet the 1 hour minimum physical activity standards per day, should we be, and I think fitness is the wrong term, but mental and physical well-being are closely tied together. Should we be pushing our RED, which is outdoor rec skills, and the old notion of fitness, which is perhaps a hangover from the National Fitness Camp sort of era back in the 40s? Should we be thinking about moving that up? Because it's been pushed all the way to the bottom. It's great to see we're starting to see those blue connections to curricula. And if we look at the curriculum of excellence in a place like Scotland, the curriculum of excellence about outdoor learning is across the curriculum and mandated for all school children, and they can pretty much get daily outdoor time because it's embedded across the curriculum. And it also can still be an episodal experience, that journey or that year-long camp, but they also have a foundation for that of virtually, we heard of the old daily PE, daily outdoor learning. And that requires all educators, your history teacher, maths teacher, English teacher, outdoor ed teacher, to be comfortable, starting to become comfortable with working with kids in the outdoors. And it might just start on the campus grounds and then be in walking distance to the school, in the neighbourhood, using public transport to get a little further. To me, it seems that outdoor educators could be great brokers, and outdoor providers could be great brokers of that experience, great teaching support, and not necessarily put off to the side as specialists that run the outdoor program. We know that time outdoors is healthy. There's overwhelming evidence for that. But how much time? Doing what? Doing where? Doing it with who? Okay? There is certainly scope for more research, particularly into this for young people. There are some excellent resources, and if you're looking to try and use some of those concepts and languages to convince your bosses and managers that this is defensible, based on research, and that there is a language and terminology around it, this is an excellent place to start. It's a large study by the people at Deakin. However, it doesn't focus necessarily or specifically on children and youth. And I think that there is still a gap there and perhaps a role for us to think about playing. I've mentioned that concept of agency before, the fact that children and young people need to feel agency, and agency, again, there's a whole theory of structure and agency, but in everyday terms it simply means that the child or young person feels that they are able to change their circumstances. Okay, that's all it means. They are able to take action and change the circumstances that they are in for the better. We are seeing some amazing examples of young people's agency. And we may well have just seen a federal election decided on a global environmental issue. Which brings us, 40 years after the Franklin campaign. And I have no doubt that young people had a very significant role in that process. Both my daughters are now in their 20s, and for the last couple of elections, they come up to mum and dad and just say, "How are you voting in this election?" And they're serious. And I know I'm probably preaching to the converted, but I imagine that conversation's going on everywhere. I once had a student writing their educational philosophy in one of those essays they have to do, and he pretty much summed it up with 4 words: never at a desk. And of course that might be, I say that slightly tongue-in-cheek, but it's not a bad idea. We are experts in working with people outdoors and in outdoor learning, and it's tempting to try and gain that credibility that other subjects seem to have without having to argue for it by being indoors at a desk on a screen. Perhaps that's not the way to go. Some thoughts on this for tertiary providers, our TAFE and university programs. Our graduates are going to need a deep knowledge of the lives of young people. And I know we already work towards this, but I don't see a lot of specialist core programs or subjects in outdoor education degrees about the lived experience of young people in the times that we face. We recently did some work at Federation University in reconceptualising our outdoor education degree, and we came up with some major streams alongside the outdoor studies, and one of those was behaviour management. And in putting that together, I went across to the psych faculty and said, well, they told me psychology is split into psychology studies, which you need to do 2 years of if you want to gain your psych degree. And because they're not working towards a psych degree, the rest of you can do behaviour management studies. That won't make you a professional psychologist. And I said, have you got any core courses there on the lives of teens and young people? Nope. Okay. There may well have been over in the 2-year psych degree, but our graduates are going to need access to that knowledge and that cutting edge research and have the skills to work with young people. And I wonder where that's going to come from. We can all go and do our mental health first aid training to couple with our wilderness first aid training. And many of you will have done mental health first aid training. But I don't think it's enough. It's a good start, it's the first step, but I think we need some more. And that older notion of a few decades ago of the camp counsellor may well be something that we need to think about. And I know many programs are working in this space already. I think we'll need a great degree of pedagogical tact, of working slowly, patiently, carefully, kindly with young people, no matter how they present to us, in schools, on our programs at universities, as we help them through this, I don't like the word mental health crisis, but through the challenges that are peculiar now to our time. And as educators, I think we need to be eternally optimistic and see a bright future of working for young people. Oh, there we are. And lastly, keep that gate open and start walking back out through it. And by the way, if you can't get out through it, you can have a look at it on YouTube. Thanks very much.